In this episode of Taking Photos at Parkrun, we're going to talk about lighting.
But first, this.
Hey guys, welcome back to Taking Photos at Parkrun. It's good to be back, David.
It is good to be back.
It is.
Loving this.
I am too. I'm learning a lot.
Oh, come on.
In this episode, we're going to talk about lighting, aren't we?
We are.
Yeah. And what?
A bit more technical, I think.
I think this one's going to be a little bit more advanced, but still within the scope of beginners. I think.
Oh, anybody can do it.
Exactly.
Just got to put your mind to it and have a bit of practice.
Exactly.
I think the good thing is we're talking to the right people.
Yes.
We're talking to runners who understand if you practice, you get better.
That's right.
And it's the same with photography.
Just practice. Okay, David, what are we going to be talking about in this episode?
All right.
When it comes to lighting.
Really, it's working with manual settings.
Yes. Don't be afraid of manual.
Manual's going to make the world of difference.
Yes. And on your little dial, it's the M normally, isn't it?
Yeah,
Not the P.
Yes.
It's the M.
Go all the way.
Yeah.
Control the decisions that the camera is
Exactly.
making.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the result will be what you ask it to do.
And once you start using this, specifically DSLRs, once you start using it on manual, you really don't go back, do you?
No, you don't. No, that's right.
Very rarely would you go back. Excellent. Okay.
And how many people have DSLRs in the drawer, in the cupboard?
Exactly,
And,
David.
So many people have said, I want to learn how to use it, but it just never comes out.
Yeah.
There's no better way than to practice getting started with a DSLR than volunteering a parkrun.
Exactly.
You got 150 people just asking you to take their photo.
That's right, even more. At some places, we always get people coming up to us, at parkrun saying, oh, yes, I've got an old DSLR that does this and that. Yeah, get it out.
That's it.
Get it out.
See you next week.
Okay, so what do you think? What are we going to be talking about, David, when it comes to lighting?
Right. So with lighting, whether it's a phone, even a DSLR, whether it's film or digital, going back to box brownies, the rules of lighting are the same.
It has never
Nothing
changed.
has changed. It's physics. So you've got three things that affect the light. Your shutter speed, your aperture, and the ISO. So the shutter speed, if it's a long shutter speed, let's say a second, the amount of action that can happen in a second will create some blur. With aperture, the effect is the depth of field. So a wide open aperture, which we'll have a look at in a minute, gives you a shallow depth of field, which means that everything in the background is more out of focus. The old bokeh.
Yeah, we talk about bokeh. Yep.
And then ISO, the effect of ISO is noise. And noise is like static.
Yeah, grain. Grain in the image.
Right. So you want to minimise that as much as possible. Yeah. So we're going to be talking about shooting in manual, and it really comes down to the exposure triangle. And it's quite a big topic, but it is easy to understand if it's well explained. And there are people better suited to that.
I can explain this well.
Right. And I think we'll put it in the links down below.
Yeah, we will. In the description, I'll have the links to Mark Wallace's video.
There's an excellent series there on the exposure triangle. Each clip is about 6 or 7 minutes long, and it just works through the process of getting on top of the exposure triangle. And when you understand that, you understand all of photography. So
make sure you watch that. Okay, the links will be in the description.
Yep. But as far as we're concerned, shooting park runners, the first thing that you need to do is think about your shutter speed, because if your shutter speed's too slow, the runners will be blurry, and if it's too high, then it'll be underexposed.
Yeah.
So I think, in my experience, 1/500th of a second is really
That's the starting point.
That's the starting point,
Yeah, that's
right.
in fact that's probably the minimum that we'd want to shoot at, David.
Yeah.
Normally.
To have sharp runners.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ideally, if you can go to 1,000, great,
Yeah.
or more. But you're going to have to give something up
Yeah.
to do that.
Mm.
So let's have a look at what happens with a slow shutter speed. I've got a couple of examples here.
Yeah.
One, and they're not runners, the first two. But this photo I took many years ago, actually using my daughter's camera before I had a camera myself. I took it down to the Gold Coast 600, and I thought I'd sit on this straight and just pan with the cars as they screamed past. And I was just trying to get the car sharp and all the background blurred. And, that's a
It worked.
good shot.
Yeah,
I like that shot. It's one of about 80 that I took trying to get that shot. And you just can't afford to do that at parkrun. If
you don't have
if
that
you
time.
were getting 1 out of 80 shots, you're going to have some cranky runners. Right. So this is not the approach to take with a parkrun. It looks good, but really you want to have the shutter speed up to stop this sort of thing
Yeah,
from
to
happening.
stop that motion.
There's another one there where a bike rider, Pato in this case, I was tracking him. I did this one with my phone and a bit of Photoshop. Thank you, Adobe. Tracking the subject as he moves, and then the background, while the shutter's open, the background goes past and creates this effect. But the downside of that is because we don't shoot that way with moving the camera at the same speed as the runner during parkrun, your camera will stay still and then the runner moves while the shutter's open, and you end up with a blurrier sort of look.
Yeah, even though the background was almost in focus, David, isn't it?
Yeah.
The runner is out of focus.
Yep. Just because of the shutter speed.
The shutter speed, yeah. And a lot of the times, this where it depends on what you're using as well.
Right. So, and then this one is just a classic example of where it works out really well.
Really well.
I just love this shot. It's telling a story.
Yep.
It's well composed.
Yeah, it is.
And the slow shutter just works so well because you can see the blur of the
water
through the photo.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a really good photo. And that was one of those days where it just poured down rain and the whole track was there was a lot of puddles around the track, and the runners actually enjoyed running in the puddles and splashing the cameraman.
Yes.
Chris. That was Chris. Well done, Chris.
Good work, Chris.
Good work.
That's right. So, I think that's the importance of having your shutter speed.
Yeah. So a slower shutter speed of less than 1/500th, especially for action, the chances of catching a blurry image of a runner is a lot more higher.
Way higher, yeah.
Anything above 500th, 1/500th, ideally 1,000, there's a better chance of you stopping motion when it comes for runners and catching those air shots and those lovely jump shots. That's the essence of that shutter speed.
Right. So when you lock that in at a high speed, the next thing you want to do is open up the aperture as much as you can to let as much light in as possible to compensate for your higher shutter speed.
That's right.
See Mark Wallace. We'll explain the ins and outs of that.
Of that exposure triangle.
Yeah. So if you want to know what we're talking about there, this is a photo of different apertures and how that looks in a lens. So for f1.4, which is a very low number, it means that the aperture ring is wide open and letting in super huge amounts of light.
You can see that, can't you? That's quite a big
opening.
Big opening for light to come into the camera.
Yep. And so most lenses for DSLRs will not be below about f4, which is this one down here. You can certainly get these other ones, but typically f4 will be a minimum.
Yeah, typically we find, David, with people who've got DSLRs, they have the kit lens, don't they?
Yeah, and kit lens, when you zoom the kit lens, it'll comes
change.
down to f5.6. So it means that you're giving up more light. There's less light coming into the camera, and when you've already put your shutter speed up to 1/500th, and then you've got less light coming in through a small aperture hole, then you're left with ISO, which we'll get to in a minute.
And the issue with getting lenses that shoot faster, they're a lot more expensive, aren't they?
Oh, way.
And that's probably the trade-off. So what we do find is that a lot of people who've got a DSLR will probably have a kit lens, and they're restricted with their f-stop to probably 4 to 5.6. Normally, that's the range that they'll sort of move through, especially with those sort of telephoto ones. Yeah.
All right. So we're talking about narrow depth of field with a small aperture. So in this case, classic example, the center part of the photo is in focus, and the foreground is out of focus, and the background is out of focus. So it's quite good. It's
lovely.
It's a nice shot. The trick then comes with getting the focus right at that point where the runner is.
Yeah.
Because if I half press the shutter to get it focused, and I don't travel all the way with my finger, then the runner will have run through that focus area before the camera.
Exactly, and you would miss it.
And you would miss it. So the workaround for that is to set the focus mode to AI servo, as it is on Canon. I think it's got another name on Nikon and Sony.
I think they do. But for we're Canon shooters at this point. But that's what it is. It's AI servo, which allows the focus point or the focus to shift.
Yeah. So as you're holding the button down, it keeps track of the subject. Yeah. And as they move through the shot, they're in focus the whole way. And then when you pull the trigger, then the runner's in focus at the time. Yeah. So that's a pretty important thing to do for runners, because they're always going to be moving.
Yeah. And it all depends on the focus system in your camera as well. Like the new sort of mirrorless cameras like David's R5 with autofocus, it's changed the game.
Crazy good.
It's changed the game when it comes to focusing. With these, you can lock on the person's eye and just track them all the way through, David, can't it?
It can be get a little lost with people running in front of the person you're trying to shoot. I shoot a bit of basketball, and that happens a lot. But it works really well if you've got a camera that's capable of eye detection and tracking. Then it's going to make your life a lot easier.
Yeah, it does.
But even if you've just got an old 600D or an old DSLR, they still have that AI servo mode. And you put it in there, they're going to track the subject through the shot. So you should definitely find out about your camera to get that working. And the other thing that you could do is not feel too bad about using f4, because it does have a deeper depth of field than 2.8, and so that makes it more forgiving. There's more of that photo will be in focus, and you still get the benefit of soft pokery
backgrounds and foregrounds,
right? So
which still f4 is still enough to separate the subject from
5.6 even. But and by positioning yourself at the right part of the course, things can be 200, 300, 400 meters away.
Exactly.
And if they're that far away, they're definitely going to be out of focus.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's nice. Here's another example of that's an f4 photo there.
It is.
We've got the foreground out of focus, background out of focus, and the subject
are in focus.
Focus.
It's a nice air shot as well.
Air shot, energy, focus, rule of thirds, all those things we talked about before. Do that.
You can see now how composition has made this photo really pop.
And on the lens I've got on here is the 2.8 70-200. I could be at 2.8, but f4 made my life easier because
it's a bit more forgiving.
And you still get the effect. So
looks great.
This photo I've included because I took it with my phone, Being a wide lenses typically have a much deeper depth of field.
Yeah.
We've got the start line there really quite in focus, and the background still pretty in focus as well.
Yeah.
So you will get that effect, and it's not all bad. We can see people in the shot, and that's good too. Shallow depth of field is not the be all and end all. It's just a feature. Tool.
And I like this one because you get those leading lines. So once again, coming back to composition from the last video, those leading lines really do draw your eye into it.
Yep. All right. Very good. So that's our aperture.
Yeah, so that's aperture, and that's an important part. And that does depend on the gear.
It does depend on the gear, but work with what you've got.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And make the most of that. So ISO. So ISO is where you go when you have not enough light, a high shutter speed to freeze the motion, a aperture that's stopped down as much as you can, but it's not enough. So you increase the ISO, which is the sensitivity of the sensor, and it's a lot like turning up the volume on an amplifier or through speakers. The more you go, the more distorted the sound becomes.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens with turning up the sensitivity of the sensor on a camera. So if there's enough light to be down around 100 or 200 ISO, you will hardly have any noise. But the further up that you take the noise, the worse ISO, the worse the noise becomes.
Yeah.
And I'll show you an example of that. The other thing is that probably when it comes down to it, the more money you've spent on the camera, the better the ISO it's going to be able to handle ISOs. So my first 600D Canon, I wouldn't take that over 1600 ISO. Anything over that, and really the shot was not usable.
Yeah. It's so grainy.
The R5 now, I'm happy at 8,000 or 10,000. You can get away with a bit more, but it's still noisy, and you're better off, if possible, to have less noise. So this is shot at 200 ISO. If we zoom right in here, you can see just a tiny little bit of grain around there next to his head. And that's ideal. That's when you're looking at the shot from this distance, you can't really notice any
grain.
Noise or grain in the background, right? This one was shot at 4000 ISO, and you can really see when you get that close that it's just very, very grainy, and where normally you'd be able to see the pupils of his eyes and a lot more detail in his face, you do give that up. But I was shooting at 1/500th of a second. I was using f4 so that I have a little bit of play with the depth of field. And to get the correct exposure, I had to be at ISO 4000. That's just where I had to be. And I got a shot instead of no shot. And that's what it comes down to.
It's a very
You're
usable,
there to take photos.
Yeah, it's a great shot too. So it's usable. It's to the normal person, it's a great shot.
Right. So really the physics is making two decisions for you. The shutter speed, you don't have to think about. You just make it 1/500th. And the aperture, you open it up as much as you can. And then you just change the ISO. That's the only thing you're really doing to get the shot to where it needs to be.
And what I find too, David, that when you look for your viewfinder on a lot of the DSLRs, they do have a meter.
Right, exactly. Yep.
And if you go towards the right-hand side, it gets more overexposed. And if the meter sort of drifts down to the left-hand side, it's sort of underexposed. So if you can get it in the middle, okay, you can adjust your ISO to get it in the middle. That's probably what they call the optimum exposure.
As long as it's metering off the right
thing.
Okay, so
hopefully.
In this instance here, if it was metering off the grass in the background, it would probably say, you're too overexposed. So you bring it down, and then the runner's going to look like that. Oh, look, that grass is nice though.
Yeah, exactly.
So, we don't want that. No. So,
but that's probably a bit more advanced when it comes to.
Sure, and that's why you chip. You get into to one particular part of the course and you set your camera up to take some photos there. You take the photo and you have a look at the back of the camera and you say, well, it's too dark, so we'll increase the ISO.
Either or,
Either or, right. Here's another one. I shot at 4,000 ISO. We looked at this one a second ago, but it's got the same situation with the noise, the details lost in the face. And
still quite, still very good.
Sure, but it is an R5.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's coping with that. Coping with that pretty well.
Yeah.
Yep. Plus, there's let's have a look at that. There's Lightroom, which is the software we're using here, deals with noise pretty well as well. So if I get in here and take off the noise reduction, that's where it started. So it's even worse. But the point here is that you can fix some of it with software.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's another good reason to post-process. Yeah. So I'll put that back. There we go. Okay, so let's have a talk about what happens when you do trust the camera to make decisions about lighting.
Yeah.
And what happens and what the pitfalls are there. So I've got this little example here of a subject. I couldn't find a running person silhouette, so we have a running ostrich.
That's close enough.
Insert runner here.
Yeah.
All right, so this box and the subject are a certain shade of grey, and we'll say that that's the right amount of light for those subjects. And the background here is very light. And so what's going to happen is the camera will say, wow, there's a lot of light in this picture. I think the best thing I can do is reduce the amount of light that's coming in. And so it will turn down the brightness until that light area becomes more reasonable and it thinks on average the photo looks good. But the problem is that our subject now has got so dark that it would just be all shadows on their face. This grey square here didn't move when I changed the amount of brightness in the whole shot. The problem is you end up with an underexposed subject because the camera feels that the background was too bright and it needed to compensate. And then the same thing happens the other way. If your background is particularly dark, the camera will say, well, that's not so good. I better boost up the amount of light that
is coming in.
So it'll turn up the brightness for the background until it says, oh yeah, that looks about even. That must be right. And here our subject is now way too bright. It will be their face is completely blown out and unusable. And really they should have been back down here. So what you do when you're shooting in manual is that you say, these are the settings that I need to be at for the subject that I'm shooting to be exposed correctly. And it doesn't matter what happens with the background.
Yeah.
The amount of light that's on the subject is correctly exposed for.
Because that's the important thing, is making sure that our subject is exposed properly. And that's why we use that triangle, the exposure triangle, to get that correct.
Right. So let's talk about how that relates to your position on the track. So this is the finish shoot at Meadowbrook, and it's always been difficult shooting there because they've got this whopping great tree, which I wish they'd cut down. That's not going to happen.
No.
But as the runners are coming up that chute, they're in this bright sunlight most of the way, and then right about where you would want them to be, they run through this tree shadow and they're just completely underexposed. Now, you can say all of my photos are going to be shot when they hit that shadow, and that'll be fine. You just correctly set up the camera to get the right light on the subject there, and then all of the background will be really, really blown out bright, and that's fine. But, there are more shots to be had outside of that shadow. And so typically I don't do that. Typically I'll set up the camera so that they're in the sun. But what it means is you can never get a shot while they're in the shadow because you can't adjust the camera fast enough to adjust that. So in this case, because it's a finished shoot, you don't have a choice. You have to be there. But if you were somewhere else on the course and you found this situation, you'd say, I'm going to walk 10 meters further forward, that tree goes away, and I've got a lot more flexibility in the shot. All right, and speaking of position on the course, these next two shots were taken just seconds apart, but from different sides of that path. And you can see how the position of the sun has affected the way the light...
The exposure.
The exposure, right. So this is an overexposed shot. I mean, it's okay because I've done the editing on it to bring their faces back.
You have. And that's a great thing about editing in Lightroom. You can bring back some of those highlights or shadows and the likes.
Right. But that's the same settings on the camera taken two steps over to the right.
Yeah.
So keep in mind where you are and where the light is in relation to all of that.
So David, we don't want to be shooting into the light, do we?
Yes, we do.
We do, yep.
Well, personal opinion. All right, let's have a look. If you've got the sun behind you,
depending on the time of day,
as well. But we're always at 7 o'clock. It's one
light.
Thing in summer and winter. The sun is low and going straight into people's faces. So this is what photos with the light behind the photographer straight into the subject's face are going to look like. It's very, very hard light.
It is.
The shadows are very dark, and they need some work to bring them up to get a bit of detail in the face. And you often find people squinting.
That's right.
Because they're looking straight into the sun. It's very low in the sky at that time of day, and it's not such a good look. Whereas if you can set the camera up to shoot with the light behind the subject, you can get some really nice rim lighting going on. So let's have a look at this. So in this case, we've got a very dark background. The sun's coming in from the, say, maybe 2 o'clock angle, and it's just lighting up that hair. The edge of the runner's bright makes a highlight there without losing any features on their face. So it's one of the advantages there of having the sun on the other side of the subject to where you are.
It just adds that separation.
Yeah. So this is my favourite part of the Meadowbrook course to shoot, because it's like money for nothing. They're just easy shots. Set the camera up so that the skin is right and everything else just falls into place. And they don't all have to be tight shots either. You've got a longer shot, which is more like what you'd get with a phone camera, perhaps. But still, the sun is the sun. Doesn't matter what you're shooting.
Exactly. And it looks great in the sense of where it's falling on the subjects.
And thinking about that ostrich example that we had before, this is an example of a really dark background where if the camera was making the decisions about what to do here, it would say, well, this shot's too dark, I'm going to brighten it up. So let's see what would happen if I did brighten it up. Well, great, we've got some nice colour in the trees and a bit of detail there, but that's not the subject. The subject is our runner. And obviously that's no longer a shot. So that's
a much pleasant
what happens
shot,
when you've got control of the camera. And we've got the opposite here. This is a very light background. And typically the camera would say in auto mode, too much light, I'll bring it down. And then we end up with the subject is way too dark and, you've lost the shot. So, that's if there's a better reason to shoot in manual, I don't know what it is. So I think that's probably enough food for thought on the
for this video. So remember the exposure triangle. If you get a chance to watch those videos by
Mark Wallace,
make sure you do, because that goes through the exposure triangle in much more detail. So when it comes to lighting, if you use your manual mode on your camera, you've got so much control over the lighting, and you then can decide on what should be lit perfectly, I suppose, or lit more so than what the camera will decide for you.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about how to do that with a phone camera as well. It's not
not just
don't have
DSLR.
those controls.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we'll cover that next week, I think.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for that. So that was the lighting video, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.